Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome back to St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary. You can see I'm here for the summer, getting ready to teach my summer elective on the Acts of the Apostles. And indeed, while we read this book often enough in the liturgy, especially during the Easter season, we get something of a distorted view of it. You can see on your screen a chart of the number of times we read each verse of the book throughout the liturgical year. And over the 3-year cycle, you can see we privilege the early parts of the book. On the left of your screen are the early verses in the book, and then I have a cumulative, the scale on the x-axis is all the verses cumulatively through the book. So on the right of your screen you have the end of the book, and you can see we have lots of lacunae. Indeed, we have whole chapters of Acts of the Apostles that we never read in the liturgy. So this course we're going to have a chance to look at the book on its own terms. That is, what did St. Luke intend to tell us in this sequel to his gospel? There's a lot of themes of this book. As you look at your chart here, you can see a few of them. The first couple of themes here are famous. Acts tells the story of how the church spread all across the Mediterranean world. Indeed, on this map, these are the nations that are mentioned in Acts chapter 2, the story of Pentecost, the story of the Holy Spirit coming upon the disciples. And you can see these nations where the people have come from. These are the people present in Jerusalem that day. They've come from all across the biblical world. Indeed, the Parthians and the Elamites, this was Persia, back during the Persian period of the Old Testament. So from the beginning, the evangelization of the whole known world is a major theme, but that's pretty famous. Another significant and not quite as well-known theme is that the more persecution the church experiences, the bigger the church gets. We're going to see that the church in Jerusalem is persecuted, and so it spreads to Samaria. And then the church gets persecuted again, and so the church spreads to Asia Minor. And then after the Council of Jerusalem, the church spreads to Europe. And then there's more persecution, and Paul ends up the book in the city of Rome. Only because of persecution does the gospel find its way even to the city of Rome. Now, in reality, we know the gospel had arrived in Rome a little earlier because of the letter to the Romans, but it's significant that the more persecution there is, the more the gospel spreads. One other theme that's very important, but often overlooked, is the relationship between the two testaments. And I'm being a little anachronistic as I say this, because of course they didn't call it the Old and New Testament in those days, but we're going to see how the Gentiles are treated in Acts of the Apostles. We're going to see especially how the Gentiles are privileged in Acts of the Apostles. The story of Cornelius' conversion in Acts chapter 10 is going to be very significant. Notably, it's the chapter after Paul's conversion, and both of those events set the stage for everything that happens in the rest of the book, as Paul goes out and becomes the apostle to the Gentiles, evangelizing all of these non-Jewish followers of Jesus. We're also going to see, and I mentioned this in my earlier video on Luke Acts as a whole, that Jerusalem has a prominence in both the Gospel of Luke as well as the Acts of the Apostles. You can see here, of the mentions of Jerusalem in the New Testament, more than 60%, nearly 2/3, occur in Luke or Acts. And indeed, it's spread out throughout the entire book. Now notice how prominent this theme is at the end of the book. Those chapters we don't read much in the liturgy, if at all. So notice that, once again, the liturgy privileges certain elements, but sometimes obscures others, and we want to pay attention to those. One other thing that's significant here is these we passages. These are famous. I have an example here on your screen. We. Who's telling the story? The traditional position is that Luke is a companion of Paul who's speaking as a fellow traveler with the great apostle. And while there's a few different takes on that, it does pose an interesting question in terms of point of view. How does the inspired author, how does Luke the evangelist, at least that's the traditional position, how does he portray the story of the early church? What events does he choose to include? What events does he choose to gloss over or not focus on? Indeed, we make a distinction often in the study of narratives, but especially in the Gospels, between the story level and the discourse level. I talk about this in my classes a lot. That on the one hand, we're going to see what happens with the various characters in the Acts of the Apostles. What does Cornelius do? What does Paul do? What does Peter do? And so on. That's the story level. But important also, and maybe even more important, what does the inspired author want to tell us, his readers, by means of his account, by means of his story? we call that the discourse level. And we're going to have a chance to explore that and in some detail here in this class. You'll notice here I use this outline a lot when I look at Luke Acts, and especially the Acts part of it. Notice the centrality of the Council of Jerusalem and the prominence of Jerusalem in the beginning, middle, and end of the book. The gospel spread, you'll see Paul's missionary journeys. Those letters MJ stand for missionary journey. This gives us the framework into which we interpolate the different letters that Paul writes. But all of this gives us a strong indication of how the Holy Spirit comes in Jerusalem, and while Jerusalem rejects it in large part, others come to accept it. I look forward to going into greater detail with you over the course of this class. Until we meet again, read well and pray well.